I've hiked all over the Appalachian Mountains for years, and I'm not the kind of person who jumps at every strange noise in the woods. Bears, coyotes, owls, foxes, I know what they sound like. I know how quickly darkness can make normal things seem frightening. What happened to me 3 years ago in western North Carolina is the only experience I've never been able to explain. I still think about it whenever I lace up my boots. It was late October. The leaves were mostly down, which meant visibility through the forest was better than during summer. The weather forecast looked perfect: cool temperatures, no rain, and almost no wind. I planned a simple overnight hike on a less traveled trail that connected with a section of an old logging road. Nothing remote by Appalachian standards, but isolated enough that you might not see another person all day. I started around noon and made good time. The trail wound through hardwood forest, crossed a few shallow streams, and climbed steadily toward a ridge. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed something odd. I hadn't seen anyone all day, but fresh footprints appeared in a muddy section of trail ahead of me. That wasn't strange by itself. What caught my attention was that they seemed to begin in the middle of the trail. There were no prints leading into them from either side. Just a clear set of boot tracks appearing out of nowhere and continuing uphill. I remember stopping and looking around, trying to figure out where the hiker had entered the trail. Maybe they stepped off a rock or crossed on fallen logs. I couldn't find an explanation. Eventually I shrugged it off and kept moving. The footprints continued for maybe half a mile before disappearing where the ground became rocky. About an hour later I reached my planned campsite, a small flat area near an abandoned logging road. The road hadn't been maintained in decades. Trees grew through parts of it, and moss covered most of the old gravel. I set up my tent, cooked dinner, and watched the daylight fade through the trees. Everything felt normal. Until sunset. I was sitting on a fallen log drinking coffee when I heard footsteps on the old road. Crunch. 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 Slow, steady footsteps. I figured another hiker was approaching and stood up to say hello. The sound stopped immediately. No footsteps. No voice. Nothing. I waited. Still silence. The road curved around a stand of trees about 50 yards away. Whoever had been walking should have appeared within seconds. Nobody did. I called out. "Hey!" No answer. I walked down the road a short distance. Nothing. The forest was completely empty. I returned to camp feeling slightly unsettled but not genuinely worried. There were plenty of innocent explanations. Maybe an animal. Maybe echoes. Maybe another hiker who stepped off the road. As darkness settled in, I climbed into my tent and started reading. Around 10 p.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time they were much closer. Crunch. 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 Slowly circling the campsite. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the road anymore. It was moving through the leaves around my tent. Not rushing. Not sneaking. Just walking. A few steps. Pause. A few more. Pause. I listened carefully. The weight sounded human. Too heavy for a deer. Too deliberate for most animals. The footsteps circled my campsite for nearly 15 minutes. Then they stopped. I waited. Silence. Eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light sleep. I woke sometime after midnight. At first I didn't know why. Then I realized everything was silent. Not normal forest silence. Total silence. No insects. No wind. No distant sounds. Nothing. The kind of silence that feels wrong. Then I heard breathing. Right outside the tent. One long inhale. One long exhale. I sat upright instantly. The breathing continued. Slow. Steady. Close enough that it sounded like whoever, or whatever, was making it stood inches from the nylon wall. I grabbed my flashlight. The breathing stopped. For several seconds I couldn't move. Finally I clicked the light on. The beam illuminated the tent walls. Nothing. I unzipped the door and shined the flashlight outside. The campsite was empty. The surrounding woods were empty. No eyes reflecting back. No movement. No sound. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Around dawn I finally relaxed enough to believe I'd overreacted. The first light of morning always makes nighttime fears seem ridiculous. Then I stepped outside. There were footprints around my tent. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Human. Clear enough to see tread patterns. They circled the tent repeatedly. What bothered me most was their distance. Whoever made them had stayed extremely close. Close enough to touch the tent. Close enough to stand over me while I slept. I packed immediately. My plan had been to spend another day exploring nearby trails, but I decided to head back. The footprints continued away from camp and onto the old logging road. I followed them for a few hundred yards. Then they stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As if the person making them had vanished. The road surface was soft enough to hold tracks clearly. There was nowhere they could have stepped without leaving evidence. Yet the prints simply ended. I remember staring at the ground for a long time. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I turned around and started hiking out. About an hour later I reached a ridge where the trail followed a steep hillside. That's when I heard a whistle. 3 short notes. Behind me. I spun around. Nobody. The woods stretched downhill for hundreds of yards. Bare trees. Gray trunks. No movement. I kept walking. A few minutes later the whistle came again. 3 notes. Closer. I picked up my pace. The whistle sounded a 3rd time. Closer still. Every survival instinct I had started screaming that something wasn't right. I wasn't worried about ghosts or monsters. I was worried about another person. An unstable person. Someone following me through isolated mountains. I stopped and listened. No whistle. No footsteps. Nothing. Then I noticed movement downslope. Far below the trail. A figure stood among the trees. Too distant to identify clearly. Maybe 200 yards away. It appeared to be facing me. I raised a hand. The figure didn't move. I shouted. No response. Then I realized something strange. At that distance, I shouldn't have been able to notice details. Yet one thing stood out immediately. The figure looked unusually tall. Not impossibly tall. Just wrong somehow. Like its proportions were off. Long arms. Narrow frame. I watched for several seconds. Then the figure stepped behind a tree. And never emerged. I hurried down the trail. For the next 2 miles I kept expecting to hear footsteps or another whistle. Nothing happened. Eventually I reached the trailhead parking area. Relief washed over me. Then I noticed a vehicle I hadn't seen before. An old pickup truck. Dust covered. No license plate. No one inside. The truck looked abandoned. As I loaded my gear into my car, I glanced toward the trail one last time. Something white was attached to my windshield. A folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped. I unfolded it. Inside was a crude pencil sketch. It showed a tent beneath trees. My tent. There was no mistaking it. The shape, the location, even the fallen log beside it. At the bottom of the page was a single sentence. I watched you sleep. No signature. Nothing else. I called local authorities before driving home. An officer met me later and took the note. They searched the area but never found anyone. The abandoned truck was gone by the time they arrived. No cameras. No witnesses. No leads. The officer suggested someone had probably been camping illegally in the area and decided to scare me. Maybe he's right. That's still the explanation I tell myself. But there are parts one can't fit together. The footprints that appeared and disappeared. The breathing outside the tent. The figure on the hillside. And the sketch. The sketch is what bothers me most. Because whoever drew it wasn't looking at my campsite from a distance. The perspective was wrong for that. The drawing showed the exact angle someone would see if they were standing right beside my tent door. Close enough to reach out and touch it. Close enough to hear every movement inside. Close enough to watch me all night. I still hike. I refuse to let one experience take that away from me. But I don't camp alone anymore. And whenever I wake up in the woods during the middle of the night, I find myself listening. Not for bears. Not for coyotes. For slow footsteps circling just beyond the tent. Waiting.